You should be able to see, hopefully, on your screen our opening slide, which says Beaver Coexistence Webinar. Can a few people just give us some feedback in your chat box about if you can hear me and if the volume is acceptable? So just checking in, are people hearing me, and also are you seeing our screen with the beaver picture and the title slide? I am doing. No, that's to stop. Seems like we're having some sort of technical difficulty. So if you're seeing us or hearing us, please provide some comments in the chat box. Oh, yeah, there we go. It looks like a few people are giving us some feedback. Awesome. So we're going to get started. And welcome to the webinar. My name is Noreen Ambrose with Cows and Fish. So we're going to talk to you today a little bit about some of the things we've been learning and that others have learned over many years about some of the tools and techniques for beaver coexistence. Helping me today is Kelsey Cartwright. She's my technical assistant, and she's going to be helping us throughout the webinar in terms of answering some questions you have during, which we won't answer any official questions until the end. But if you have something pressing you want to throw in your chat box during, you certainly can. And she'll be also leading us through our polls today. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Cows and Fish, our long handle is the Alberta Riparian Habitat Management Society, so you can understand why Cows and Fish is a little bit easier to remember. Our approach is really to help people understand what riparian areas are and the benefits of healthy riparian areas, and to encourage and foster that stewardship of riparian areas for the benefits not only of the ecosystem, the riparian area, but for the landowners, land managers, and for communities to gain those benefits. So our focus today, of course, is about beavers and how beavers change our landscape. Because they do have a lot of ability to make changes to our landscape, they are often called ecosystem engineers. They are a keystone species, but that engineering sometimes causes consternation and gets them into trouble with people when they're doing things that we're not happy with. And so what I first would like to start off is getting a sense of your knowledge and understanding of beaver coexistence techniques. So Kelsey's just going to launch a poll here. So if you could just take about 30 seconds to just click your knowledge or perception on these things, we'll move forward. So again, have you considered using any of these techniques? So just another 10 seconds or so when we'll close the poll. Great, thank you for those of you that participated. And so just so you understand how many people responded, 20% of people responded, of course, as you may have seen in there, to sound or to chemical deterrents they've thought about, 49% to pond leveling devices, 41% to exclusion approaches, and 12% to feeding to reduce cutting, and then 44% of you had never considered any of those techniques. And there are, of course, other techniques, but we can only include so many in a poll. So thank you. That gives us a sense of your knowledge and also where what you may be familiar with before this presentation. I'd also like you to describe yourself in this next poll. Tell us if you're a landowner, a student, government, non-government, or other. Great. It looks like just about everybody has voted. So it looks like about 13% of you are landowners, 9% are students, 39% are representing government, 20 with non-government organizations, and 20% are with other people. Great. So we have a real mixture of attendees. So thank you for being here, and hopefully you'll find something that you can take home. This work is part of a collaborative we're doing with the Mistakis Institute, which we're broadly calling Putting Beavers to Work for watershed resiliency and restoration. And this work is really recognizing that beaver coexistence relies upon a number of factors. We're going to focus today on some of the actual tools and techniques for that coexistence, but I'll highlight some of the other things we're working on as well. Beavers are, of course, an icon in Canada. They are not only in a lot of our name places, but also on our nickel. And so they are also what shaped a lot of Canada and North America. You might ask, well, why is Cows and Fish working on things related to beaver? And of course, we're not really working on beavers, you know, in the sense of managing wildlife directly, but rather we're working on them because of the key role they play in riparian health and riparian ecosystems. In southern Alberta, that riparian area is that highly visible green place when it's dry, or in the surrounding landscapes in late summer. And that riparian area, of course, evolved with beavers. So that's why we're so interested in helping find mechanisms and ways that that we can coexist more effectively. Beavers are, of course, a semi-aquatic mammal that spend a lot of their time in water, and that time that they spend out of water is also pretty impactful in terms of the amount of cutting they do, and that causes a lot of challenges and frustrations when we don't necessarily want all the trees cut around a water body, for instance. They flood our crops and our roads, and they cause issues with culverts being plugged, as this photo shows, where they've been very industrious filling in material and plugging that culvert. And you can imagine, I'm sure some of you are probably with municipalities who have to unplug these kinds of culverts. It's extremely costly and also dangerous, and can be quite a problem, because if they're not unplugged, you end up with flooding like this. There's a culvert in the sort of center below that larger log that's laying there, and it's obviously plugged and causing real issues in the early spring. These kinds of flooding issues and infrastructure challenges are just part of the frustrations, of course, that beavers cause us. And traditionally we didn't have, or maybe we didn't think about, a lot of other techniques besides continuing just to unplug the culvert as needed or remove the beavers. But a number of years ago, we started working collaboratively, not only with Mistakis, but also the Anna and Sandy Cross Conservation, and learning more about other options and alternatives. In 2013, the Anna and Sandy Cross Conservation Area started a citizen science initiative, which we participated in, and that has led us through this process of trying to find more concrete and specific ways that we can implement coexistence techniques and learn more about them to share with others. So that's the kind of sharing we're going to do today. You might think that beavers are good, you might think that they're bad, but really beavers are just being beavers. The problem is, of course, sometimes the things they do cause them to be in conflict with what we do. That we have a long history, of course, of settlement, and the reason that North America was expanded into from Europeans was, of course, because of the beaver. And so beavers are underpin not only our landscapes, but also our social structure. So I'm not going to spend much time on beaver biology and science about their natural history. I'm going to quickly breeze through this, but I wanted to give you a bit of background for those of you that aren't familiar with it, and also because if you understand beaver biology and their behavioral aspects, it can help in terms of management. So beavers' teeth, of course, continue to grow. That orange layer on their teeth is harder, and it erodes slower than the whiter layer behind, the non-enamel layer behind, and because it's constantly growing, they're needing to constantly chew on things, and because the front erodes or away slower, that means they keep a sharp edge on their teeth. So colony has a couple adults, which are the parents, 2 young of the year, and then 2-year-olds. And obviously every colony is going to be a bit different, but they do respond to better food and water conditions with larger kit numbers, and of course success of their family depends on all sorts of things, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute, including mortality. Not only do they face disease and predation, of course, risks, but occasionally bad luck, perhaps, with trees falling on them. but their primary, that's obviously not their primary cause of death. They survive through the winter by creating caches of food around their lodges like this, where they have many sticks that they've cut from other places and have partially submerged so that they can access them once there's ice cover on the pond. They also, of course, make dams to help store more water and ability levels, and they can make them out of a wide variety of materials, including even cattails and mud when there are no trees and shrubs available. But they do like to build them in series, as you can see in this picture on the right. That gives them more swimming opportunity, longer distances, and more habitat that they can access. And they generally like relatively low gradient streams, wide valleys, and of course, preferably lots of aspen and willow for food sources. They live, of course, in ponds as well as in streams. So in wetlands and lake type settings, they do prefer to have sites that have limited fluctuation of not more than 1.5 meters and a winter drawdown of not more than 70 centimeters. And of course, that's because they need to maintain adequate depth under ice cover, which in Alberta is sometimes quite deep. And if there's not enough ice left, of course, they can't necessarily survive, or pardon me, enough water left. There's not the ability potentially to survive, and they might not be able to access their food caches. They do eat a lot of woody material, and there's some estimates from research that suggest that a colony needs about an acre of aspen for each 1 to 2.5 years. So it is an important part of their food storage, although it's not the only food they eat. And actually, although it's the dominant food source in winter because it's what they've cached, in the fall, spring, and summer, they eat many other things, including herbaceous material that is that is gathered both in the pond as well as adjacent to the pond that they're in, or stream. They can move as much as 200 meters for food gathering, but of course that's pretty risky. They're not that speedy and great on land compared to their predators, and so generally most of their movements are closer, maybe even in the range of 30 meters to the edge of water. This picture shows a bunch of different kind of beaver routes away from the pond, and you can see that they're struggling to find material close to the pond as they eat it up and cut it down, and it hasn't had a chance to regrow. They certainly do also, we've heard from many agricultural producers, sometimes harvest crop or forage as well if it's close by, and that's a ready food source sometimes. When they do cut trees and shrubs down, poplars or aspen respond by sprouting, but those sprouts tend to have increased chemical compounds which are essentially bitter and undesirable, and so that encourages beavers to move to larger material, cutting larger stems. Compared to that, willows don't do that. They don't send out shoots with additional chemicals in them, and so willows are considered in a symbiotic relationship essentially. So beaver cutting increases their proliferation overall. Of course, depending on the amount of cutting, they can take them all, but that sprouting is triggered by additional cutting. Now, not all dams are, of course, like the one I showed before with cattails. Probably people are used to seeing them made out of twigs and sticks of various amounts. So their dams are quite leaky. They're not solid structures. Not only does water flow over the top, but it flows over the face and also through gaps. And that indirect flow path with many roots helps reduce the amount of erosion, and also reduces the head or the pressure behind the stream. Beaver pond cycles are really about when sometimes beavers do eat themselves out of house and home and they have to move on. And in cases, certainly their dams can go unmanaged, so to speak, if they don't keep them maintained, and they can blow out occasionally, of course, as well if they've all been removed due to predation or perhaps humans have removed beavers, then their dams, of course, can blow out. But in general, that's not a big for concern, at least in most of Alberta, but there is a small amount of research that shows in large situations where really extensive beaver dams and high volume, there has been some flooding downstream. So what is the role that beavers play in the watershed? Well, in addition to storing water in places like Beaver Creek, which this stream is called, when there's drought conditions, they help store a lot of water. And when they go missing, of course, they're not there to store that water. Beaver modify valleys through millennia in our part of the world 10 to 12,000 years since glaciers left, that long-term accumulation of sediment behind streams, dams, is what has built the soils and reshaped the valleys. And there are usually long series or sequences of both occupied and unoccupied and managed dams throughout a watershed. That march of time, of course, basically builds up materials and creates deeper, flatter valleys with sediment that's rich and moist across the floodplain and stream settings. That storage and trapping of material in the shorter term in a pond can amount to a lot of material that in some of the larger ponds that have been researched, that can amount to over 380 tandem dump trucks worth of sediment stored at a single pond. So the sort of water hold storage capacity of materials is significant for water quality, only removing solids and phosphorus and nitrogen, the nutrients that we are often concerned about, but also storing carbon and cleaning water from fecal coliforms. Sorry about that. We just have to improve our interconnect connection. We're having some issues. We're getting some feedback. So let me go back to where we were. So beavers not only store water by building dams on streams and rivers, but of course in ponds or wetland situations and around lake margins as well, they enhance their water storage significantly by building or digging out canals. Many of you may have stepped in them and fallen in them if you've walked around a wetland that's had beavers in the past. Riparian and sort of adjacent storage in water can be really important, but often invisible. That groundwater storage that's held in the pond is what moves into the adjacent area, can be hundreds of meters laterally and several hundred meters downstream influence as well. And that research has suggested that leads to up to 9% increase in open water in watersheds with more ponds and beavers, and as much as 30 to 60% of a watershed can be held in beaver ponds. So they're very important in terms of total water storage, and it's a bit like an iceberg. We really only see the surface bit, which is the pond itself, and we don't recognize always the value of the groundwater stored. By storing water, they're not making new water, but they are allowing it to seep back out longer and for longer periods in seasons when there wouldn't otherwise be as much water. And that additional annual downstream flow can be from 2 to 10 times as much, which is, again, very beneficial for aquatic ecosystems. The ponds themselves and the dams, of course, catch the water and slow the velocity, acting a bit like a speed bump to reduce energy and add that friction. The roughness of ponds and their materials that are in the ponds or adjacent to the ponds is part of what slows water down and dissipates some of that energy. And although beaver ponds are generally not going to be the solution to overall flooding, they do help reduce peak flows and dissipate some of that energy. And more ponds leads to more flood reduction on the whole. Storing water allows that water to be cooler and infiltrate the groundwater, which is of course beneficial for species like trout and salmon. And often the water isn't just the stuff that's sitting there holding on, but it's the stuff that comes back in from groundwater that is cooler. And in some parts of North America, beavers are being used to help actually restore watersheds for salmon habitat. Because beavers create additional wetland habitat, additional riparian width if there's a lot of longer term water storage. They are also creating areas that are very diverse from a biodiversity and wildlife perspective. And that diversity, of course, creates connectivity between similar areas on the landscape. So just a quick review of what do beavers do aside from habitat and water quality. They actually change nutrient cyclings. They actually create wetlands. And of course, as part of their water quality improvement, they're retaining sediment and materials and actually shaping or changing the geomorphology of the water body, the stream or the river and the ponds around it. They not only change the storage amount, but they change the duration, and they actually can increase overbank flooding, which you may or may not think is a good thing. They increase the amount of time that the water is spending, and that means there's more time for it to soak in. And of course, they generally are creating networks of dams, ponds, and canals that both retain, detain, store, and slowly release water. Sometimes we don't want all that water, and so we're going to talk a little bit about understanding how we can coexist with beavers by understanding how to control water a bit better in the context of beaver management. For those of you that haven't been part of them, just to let you know, we've been doing a series of workshops that talks more about this detail. So I encourage you to contact us if you're interested. And there's also some webinars that we've done with the Fur Bearers Alliance online as well. We also have a number of written materials which you can check out our website for, or request a paper copy if you're interested to learn more about beaver ecology and their role in watersheds. Now, most of you would be familiar with the way that we normally get rid of beavers when they cause problems. That's typically lethal or live trapping. It might be shooting as well. To some degree, other techniques are used, but these are the most common, certainly in Alberta. So how, beyond removing beavers, how do we address living with them when they are causing problems, which they do pose often and frequently? So a few different ways that you might think about. In Alberta, it's not a common practice, and it's a bit challenging from a regulatory perspective to make it happen. But the Anna and Sandy Cross Conservation Area began, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, about 2013 to start look at reintroduction of beavers in the Pine Lake watershed just southwest of Calgary. This is a large dam, an earthen dam essentially, that was created in the watershed many years ago. And you can see in the far left side, there's an outflow, and it's actually quite deep, and they introduced beavers from some that were needing to be removed from other areas, and rather than having them put down, and they built some artificial boxes for them to live in temporarily, and then they eventually built their own home. In the process of doing that, they also did a bunch of education and outreach and citizen science involved to help with the monitoring and understand what was happening on the site. They put a pond leveler in at the outflow as well, which is, you can see a small pipe there where Greg is standing on the bottom right picture, and that was to help ensure it didn't get too deep because the earthen dam that is on the downstream side is only able to handle a certain capacity. One of the challenges that they have faced is predation. They recognize that some of the beavers that they've introduced into that site and another have probably been lost due to cougars and perhaps other predators, and but they do see success, and the beavers have built small upstream pond dams as well, you can see in the top left picture. And then they helped the beavers basically by helping build some artificial ponding areas downstream of their the dam holding to help provide more water storage and help get the jump start for the beavers to move between sites. I want to talk a little bit about the Beaver Whisperer. Some of you may have seen this film, and I certainly encourage you to look at it. Michel Leclerc in Gatineau Park had spent decades battling beavers, constantly trying to address the flooding that they were causing, and really, I think, was a real leader in understanding that if we think about how beavers behave and manage, we can coexist more effectively. And he was, I think, one of the real reasons that we now better understand that beavers respond to running water, and that's a key part to the solutions in terms of coexistence, trying to shift stimulus away from areas of conflict to areas that are undesirable, maybe not from a beaver perspective, but for ours, in terms of not worrying about where they cause dams or flooding. And so if we can use their innate behaviors and sort of redirect them in a controlled way, that can be really effective. And he also was really instrumental in doing a lot of pond leveler devices, putting in over a couple hundred of them in the park, and living with them in a way that helped reduce not only manpower and costs, but also allowed the beavers to be maintained. And he also put in these fence posts that are sort of mimicking or a dam, encouraging beavers to block them further, because again, they're responding to the sound of running water created at these fence posts. So beavers don't just live, of course, in our area. They live across lots of parts of North America, and in Utah, in a much warmer climate. They also recognize the role that beavers were playing. In 2010, the state adopted a beaver management plan with the goal to help maintain healthy, functional beaver populations and gain the benefits from beavers, but they recognize that they also cause some problems. And one of the things that they recognized they needed to understand better is what the actual benefits of beavers were. And they, with some other nonprofits, an economic analysis of beaver ecosystem services was completed, which you can see here. And the millions of dollars per year that are attributed to the value of beavers was quite significant just in the Escalante River Basin. They also did a bunch of mapping for potential beaver restoration and identified that approximately a third of the area was what they identified as quick wins, opportunities where beaver conflict would be minimal and where habitat was actually already quite good, and that reintroducing or allowing beaver recolonization in those areas would be quite successful. And this allows them to prioritize management zones where there are more quick wins. So Dr. Joe Wheaton spoke at a symposium we helped organize in December, and he talked also more about the beaver dam analog research that they're doing in Utah to encourage or speed up this process of recolonization, basically jump-starting the beaver dams for the beavers, making their more suitable habitat more quickly. And as you saw in the Gatineau Park example, it's basically putting posts into the stream bed to speed up that trapping of material, and also even weaving material in there to help create a pseudo dam. In the Edmonton area of Alberta, they've been taking a little bit of a different approach, but similar concept of trying to minimize conflict through adaptive management, and working with researchers from the U of A. They have been implementing beaver management techniques for a couple of years now, and we're focusing on pond leveling devices. It's a very flat terrain in this area, a knob and kettle morainal system, and they wanted to understand if they could work, and they also wanted to understand the cost-benefit analysis compared to traditional techniques which the county would do, which would be going out and manually removing dams or blowing them up or shooting the beavers, and trying to understand the cost differences if there were any. In that area, of course, beavers in unmaintained and small roads would literally carve paths through it. This is in a park setting. They also, of course, plug culverts and create road issues, as in many areas. And so their traditional standard techniques would be removal of dams with equipment or with explosives. And so they started this process of pond leveler installation and put in approximately, with the university researchers, a couple dozen, and you can see a before and after picture here. So they haven't stopped the dam from occurring, but rather they're controlling the height of the water. And I'll talk more about the technique later, but one of the things I thought was really useful, they had two different components to the cost-benefit research, and some of the sites were on the Blackfoot Cooking Lake provincial recreation area, which is basically a recreation area that has horse and hiking, or in the winter foot use, like skiing and things, and it also has grazing and wildlife observation. And they looked at the 12 installation sites there and realized that the park area would save $80,000 over 3 years in comparison to their standard costs of maintenance that they had been implementing. So that's pretty significant. On the sites that were outside of the park area, but on within the county, Dr. Glynis Hood and her colleagues looked at the traditional versus alternative management of 13 sites over 2 years, and identified that the present net benefit to the county was over $34,000, but it would be more like almost $230,000 if you include the value of wetlands, the role that they are playing. And so there's a pretty significant economic benefit. And these techniques cost, on average, approximately $1,000 to install and have very, very little to no maintenance costs. And so the big difference that they identified is that, of course, at a roads perspective, you have heavy equipment, which you have to get to and from these places when they're plugging culverts, and that's a significant cost. These costs that Glynis Hood and her colleagues identified were also underestimates because the county wasn't able to keep track of all of their actual traditional costs. So they knew that if anything, the benefit financially would have been greater if all of those costs had been included. The county recognized that part of the issue was not just finding a technique that's successful, but also education. And so their signage is an important part of their project as well. Some of the other ways that we might coexist with beavers are related to how we manage habitat, both purposefully and even indirectly. And it can be things like looking at how we leave habitat in areas that's desirable for beavers and redirect them away from areas that are maybe less preferential from a conflict perspective, but also recognizing if we can leave habitat and food opportunities where we don't mind beavers, where they're not causing conflicts, there's a greater opportunity to gain the benefits and of course minimize those conflicts. And that can be through a whole host of different kinds of land use management practices, of course. You might consider tree wrapping a type of management technique for their habitat, certainly in urban areas or next to homes and yards. It's pretty common that people wrap, but wrapping effectively means not using light wire like chicken wire on the right, and also wrapping tall enough, closer to 3 and 4 feet, and very heavy gauge fine mesh that's usually gives the tree some extra space in terms of it doesn't fit tight against the tree, so it can grow a bit. The City of Calgary has some great information on their website and video if you're interested in learning more about effective tree wrapping. We also look at how fencing or exclusion has been done in some cases effectively, in other cases not as effectively, such as in this site. This is not that effective because the debris and material are building up, the sediment on the inside of the fence, and also there's no ability for, in this case, fish of any size to move, or other wildlife because of this mesh size, and the debris opportunities on the upstream, the left side of the fence, are quite significant because there's a large area and opportunity for that to be plowed down or pushed in due to debris catch. So we've been working with the Fur Bearers Alliance, and they've been helping us and others learn more about effective building of these kinds of techniques. These and others are part of a group of demonstration sites that we are following and learning from, and working with partners to learn from, and landowners to track them through time, understand the health and changes in management and maintenance opportunities or needs, so we can better share that with others. So one of the first ones that we encountered was Pierre Bolduc out west of Calgary. He's basically been doing a feeding station for a number of years. He loves beavers, recognizes the values, and doesn't have a conflict with the way his land is associated with the beaver ponds. And so he actually has an agreement with the county or the municipal district to cut the aspen in the roadside areas next to the road near his place. He hauls it to the beavers and provides it at the edge of the pond. And this is obviously benefit for the beavers, and Pierre likes to do it, and conveniently the county then, or the MD, doesn't have to spray or cut the ditches to keep the encroachment away from the road edge. And you can see in the bottom picture there, that's the pond that is near Pierre's home, the beaver dam, or beaver lodge rather, in the middle of it. They don't cut very many trees or shrubs around it because they don't need to. They're quite happy to eat the material that's provided to them. And Pierre makes sure, of course, in the late summer and fall, he's adding additional material so that they can stockpile their cache for the winter. Other places that are doing that are places like the Ellis Bird Farm. Again, this is in more of an interpretive setting. They have a small series of ponds near their buildings and limited, just a few trees around the edges, but they have some land adjacent nearby that has lots of young aspen growth, which they cut and feed. And that has helped then maintain the population longer, although of course it's not a long-term guarantee to keep the beavers present. At least they have food and they can maintain the trees near their facility. We've been doing a series of workshops, as I mentioned, to help build a community of practice, a group of people who know how to use some of these beaver coexistence techniques, and particularly pond levelers and effective fencing or exclusion techniques with the expertise that the Fur Bearers has provided. Leading these workshops, we've been able to be part of installing sites in 7 locations with the City of Calgary, the Municipal District of Foothills, and then counties of Barrhead, Lac St. Anne, and Starland. So a variety of locations in Alberta, from the grassland to the montane and southern part of the boreal. So as I mentioned, exclusion devices are really about fencing out the beaver, mostly on culvert type settings, and pond levelers are about trying to manage the height, or rather the depth of the water in a beaver pond that's behind a dam in a way that reduces the conflict it might cause. So in the City of Calgary, in Griffith Wood, this is a park area in Calgary, they have installed a pond leveler and exclusion device that we were part of. And the pond leveler is pretty simple. It kind of creates an opportunity for a pipe to go over and through the dam that's allows water to continue to flow. And whatever height that pipe is set at is the height that the water will long-term stabilize at. You protect the upstream end with a wire cage, essentially, to prevent the beavers from getting at it and trying to plug it, and that allows the water to continue to flow. In the Calgary setting, this was 2 sites, one which was a pathway with a small bridge over. As you can see, like lots of plugging from the beavers. They didn't have much except spruce to cut, yet they continue to try to cut down everything they can to hold water here. And then the other was along a chunk of paved or asphalt pathway, which had a culvert under it that they were likewise continuing to plug. And that Adrian Nelson with the Fur Bearers there is helping educate us and tell us about the techniques and appropriate development there. And essentially, when you're fencing off a culvert, you're trying to create a trapezoidal effect. Adrian is standing in the deepest part of the water, and that's the flat side that the water is running into. But the other wing sides actually angle inward to reduce opportunities for beavers to use them to build a side dam on. And also, of course, it reduces the ability for materials to catch on there. And in a park setting, the addition of the wood rails around the top adds strength as well as sort of eye appeal in an urban setting. So this is the site showing sort of the upstream, the downstream, and then the water flow through the completed project. At the other site where we did a combination, we build a cage for the pipe on land, making sure to use heavy gauge wire. Ideally, you use galvanized because it rusts less quickly, and ensuring you have tight folds without sharp bends in the corner. So a tight fold, but without kinking the wire so that it snaps, and using hog nose rings and pliers to attach the wire together. And so this is what it looks like close up and afterwards. The cage is enclosing the upstream end of the pipe, and the pipe is going up to the edge of the small little bridge, and it's covered back up by the beavers actually the next time we visited there. Interestingly, this site not only has fencing nearby, so there's limited things to cut on individual trees for the beavers, but this site actually has had spawning brook trout just a couple months after we were there in the fall. So it's not a very deep water body, but it does have fish spawning in it. The other sites we did as part of this project in those couple days were sites with the MD of Foothills. And this was a really, really high, steep road verge down into a ditch that has a culvert at the bottom. The municipal district had, of course, regularly had to go out there and unplug it. Very difficult for them to get large equipment down a steep slope and into the only small flat area, which is right beside the culvert, was a safety hazard, as well as just a costly in terms of time to get there and repeatedly deal with this each year. And they were very happy with the cage that was installed and the pond leveling device, which was basically taken out as far as we could for the back end of the pond to continue to ensure flow happened. In a site like this, where there was a lot of large rocks that were placed there to manage the culvert stability long term, it's a little bit more challenging to leave enough rocks, but yet create a base which has wire on it that the beavers can't dig under. This site has been running since September of 2016, and talking to the road and transportation staff there. They're very happy with this. They have not had any issues. They haven't had to go back and do any maintenance. They haven't had to unplug anything, and so it's been a really good, successful implementation for them. This fall, we put in a number of other sites working with Starland County. A similar device was put over, in this case, a dam that was near a road. Again, try to control the depth of the water in the pond behind it to reduce flooding of the adjacent roadway. As you can see, the installation process, trying to get the pond leveling device, the pipe, basically to the height that's acceptable, and then anchoring it into place. And I'll talk a little bit more about the techniques with a couple of the other examples. This is another site we were involved in. This is the before pictures in Lac St. Anne County, so outside of Edmonton a ways. They had a large, heavy steel grate that they typically went in with heavy equipment and unplugged on a fairly frequent basis. Again, this is at the edge of a road and was causing flooding issues. They brought in heavy equipment to remove some of the material that was in front of the grate so we could work. And they did choose to leave the grate because they were apprehensive and uncertain, I guess, if this new technique would actually succeed. So they left the heavy grate with the cables on it so they could pull it out if needed. But you can see we are assembling the fencing material on the shore and then built the cage around the entrance to the culvert. And you can see that the sort of open space behind the main cage had to be fenced out because you don't want the beaver to come up on land and then walk back down into the cage. So you have to make sure that area is fenced out. And this is the same site a little bit ago, taken by the folks at the county who very graciously shared this photo. So you can see there was no issues. It's maintaining itself. And one of the issues we sometimes hear about people being concerned about is what happens during ice conditions. Water was still moving through here, and certainly we hope to get some pictures from what it looks like in the spring. But these devices are being used in other parts of North America and have been for over a decade, and ice generally is not an issue. It forms on them, but if they're built well, it can withstand them. Nearby there, we built another device, a pond leveler demo. So this is maybe a few more details. So you use a double-walled pipe, which is corrugated on the outside and smooth on the inside, to address, in this case, a very significant dam that's again near a roadway and quite a deep pond. It was at least 9 feet deep upstream of this dam. And working on shore nearby, you built the cage, you drill holes in the pipe so it will sink, and you cut out a notch so that it actually allows the water to create less noise as it's entering and exiting the pipe. And then of course you put the pipe inside the cage to get it out there. One of the challenges with each of these sites is that every site is different. You had to weight down the pipe in this situation, and then we had to float it out using a tire tube and some ropes up to the nearby bridge and a canoe. So each site is a little bit different, but you can imagine that once it's in, it's stable and it will should do its job, which it did within minutes of being completed. And this site was also revisited by the county recently. The water was still flowing. You could hear it under the snow, so to speak, and there have been no maintenance needs since it was installed in September. Going back to Pierre Bolduc, and he's the site landowner that has been feeding beavers. He also has been instrumental in getting some changes at the MD of Foothills on that land. Essentially is an environmental reserve that's adjacent to his home, and they had ongoing issues with the culverts that went under roadway plugging, being dammed and collapsing, and flooding the adjacent road, and therefore access for some of the other landowners to getting into their land on the flooded side. And so there was a lot of debate in the area. The municipality worked with many of the landowners to try and find something that would work for everybody. Some of the landowners simply did not want to have the risk of ongoing flooding and certainly would have preferred to just have beavers removed so there wouldn't be constant flooding issues. But by putting in these beaver proof culverts. They've really managed to meet everybody's needs. Those that are happy with the beaver, such as Pierre and neighbors, have maintained the beavers, but they've minimized the maintenance costs. In fact, they don't have any costs now. The beavers can't plug these because the grate is vertical and they can't get at it. And the area under the culvert ends has been dug a little deeper, so that means that the beavers basically can't reach up and try and put material into the bottom of these culvert tees. So it's been a really successful technique, and the county's been really happy with it, the municipal district, because again, it reduced their maintenance for this roadway. So what do beavers need? Well, they need a lot of different things, including sometimes time and space. And you can see that in these shots, things evolve. Beavers sometimes leave, sometimes their dams do blow, and we have sites like this. And then to compare that to as it grows back in, that sediment is rich and deep and will fill back in. And that's part of the sort of natural processes that happen in beaver modified landscapes. And they do just need that time and that space to allow these things to happen. And if we can identify management techniques that allow us to have less conflicts, to minimize the negative impacts, there can be opportunities for us to gain those benefits from beavers. So just a little bit of information on some of the work we've been doing with our collaboration. I encourage you to go to our website and look at our materials. You can also contact us if you want to be on a list. We're gathering names for future demonstration site opportunities in Alberta, as well as names of people who are constantly telling us they want to give us beavers or donate beavers to someplace else. And although relocation isn't a realistic option for the most part, except at a research level right now in Alberta, it might be in the future. And certainly from a research perspective, there might be some interesting opportunities to try out some things, including some of the techniques we're talking about at demonstration sites. I encourage you to go to the Leave It to Beavers website, which the Mistakis runs, and that has some of the new fact sheets related to these coexistence tools and beaver dams and fish, presentations from the researchers who presented at our symposium, as well as you'll see a link there for some of the videos. We will be coming out with some new videos as well shortly that if you sign up to the website there, get your name on the mailing list, then you can you'll find out when the new videos are ready, which show how some of these coexistence techniques were built. You'll also see some of the survey results on their website if you're interested. We did with the Mistakis led a comprehensive survey of Albertans to understand what people's knowledge and understanding is. So that's an interesting resource for some of you who might want to check that out. Just want to acknowledge a number of individuals who helped provide some of the beaver specific imagery and let you know about letting us work with you. We have lots of opportunities for more beaver awareness and new tools, touring some of the demonstration sites, and of course we're hoping to continue our Train the Trainer, building more people who are familiar and comfortable using these techniques and following through on some of the demonstration sites. So feel free to contact us if you're interested in more information. I'm going to ask you again to fill out a poll to tell us if you increase your understanding of some of these beaver coexistence techniques as a result of the webinar. This is one of the ways that we evaluate our work. So if you just want to take about 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and just identify any of those that you feel are applicable for you. So it looks like just about everybody's voted, and about 28 people identified that they had learned things about sound or chemical deterrents. 88% learned about pond leveling devices. That's great, since I spent quite a bit of time on that. I'm glad that was new for many of you, as well as 3/4 of people learned about beaver exclusion, and 73% learned about feeding to reduce cutting in undesirable locations. So thank you for filling that in. That gives us great feedback to understand what you were able to take from today's workshop and webinar. So just a few thoughts. I encourage you to think like a watershed, think about interconnectivity, how one portion of the landscape is connected to another, both for beaver management and more broadly. And I am happy to take some questions. I'm just going to give everybody an opportunity to know who has helped fund our work, and thank them for the funding and the opportunity to do this work, which has been really rewarding, and we look forward to continuing to work with numerous partners into the future. So I see that we have some questions, and we do have time for questions. One of the first ones is, are there techniques for discouraging lodge building on lakes? And so close to lakeshore residences in particular. And I would say that except for obviously there's the sound detractants. I didn't talk about it, but there are some people using noise cannons and things, but I'm guessing you don't want to do that near your residences or other people's residences. I would suggest most of the deterrent factor is really heavy use or pets, as in dogs and people. Traffic is sometimes a deterrent, but I don't know of any other specific techniques that you might use. There is some work, and again, I couldn't touch on everything, that people are using things like castor oil. So that's basically a scent marker, which can deter, because beavers are territorial. If they believe that the area is occupied by a different beaver, that might help deter them. That has to, of course, be reapplied regularly because it washes off and it's a natural compound. So hopefully that answers that question. One of the next question is, can fish migrate through pond levelers? And the answer to that is definitely yes. In fact, in each of the sites that we've been building, the goal is to make sure that the mesh size in the cage is big enough. In fact, big enough actually for small beavers to fit through it, but definitely all fish that would naturally inhabit those areas. Beavers can fit through, but they can't really take a stick with them very easily to turn it, because they'd have to learn how to not turn it crosswise. So fish definitely passage is an important part of that movement. You're creating a big open space, and the wire around it is also meant to be big enough. So another question, how often do pond leveling devices result in beaver abandoning the area due to not being able to get the water as deep as they'd like? That's a really good question, and I haven't seen any research on that, but my understanding from working with the fur bearers and the many groups that are doing this more in eastern US, it doesn't generally create abandonment if you don't make it too low. So your goal is to give them enough depth that it's still deep enough for them to survive successfully. In fact, you're generally only taking off, I'll call it the top part of the height of the dam with the water removal. You still want it to be deep enough. You don't want to expose the lodge. Of course, the beavers will die or abandon the site. So the goal is to just take off the top of the water column to reduce the flooding damage, but you still have to leave enough water. And there's not, except for the information I showed you before about how much water they need. I haven't seen any research on that yet, so that's a good observation. Next, we have a question that says, do you know if there are any progress on putting beavers on the plant skid label? And I'm assuming, or is there any push for this? And I'm sorry, I don't really know. I think you're meaning as in the use of that chemical as a, maybe you can respond to Cheryl, as a beaver deterrent, right? I don't know if there's been any progress. I have heard that the city of Calgary mentioned that they were looking at trying to understand all of the rodent opportunities. In Alberta, apparently most of our deterrent or chemicals that are used elsewhere are not, they're not for these kinds of rodents, and they're not for use near water, or at least those aren't on label specifications. So I don't know of any push, certainly at the provincial level, but that might be an area, if it's safe to do so, that might be an option. There's another question here about, have you ever heard of using flagging to deter beavers from impounding culverts and other structures? I haven't heard of that. Certainly, I suppose it could be successful, kind of a scarecrow technique or idea that you're scaring or creating movement that seems unsafe. Although my impression from most things, including scarecrows, is that if it's there for a long period of time, even if it is flapping, they begin to get used to it. Some of the work we've seen them do, beavers that is, in downtown Calgary, suggests they can get used to a lot of unusual things and just gets desensitized to them. Do beavers ever get caught in the exclusion devices or other animals? Good question. Again, of all the people that we've worked with on this, we haven't heard of that being an issue at all. I'm not saying they couldn't, but the cage at the end is meant to be covered at all entry points for land animals. And so if they're big enough that they can't get into the cage, as in, let's say, something as big as a coyote or whatever, they just won't be able to get into it. If they can get through the squares, then they can also get back out because the squares are quite large. If it's a bird or something, of course, they can fly through the cage holes or up and out because the top is generally wide open. So not saying it couldn't happen, but it is designed with that sort of thought in mind, is to minimize any of those issues for sure. Looks like that's all the questions. We have time for a couple more if anybody wants to put something in our question box. I'd be interested too for anybody to contact us afterwards if you have great stories you want to add to our knowledge base, if you want to add to our demonstration site understanding, if you're somebody who's got some experience that you'd like to share afterwards, that'd be great too. So there's one more question that asks if we've had luck with latex and grit paint on trees. Thank you for asking that. I didn't talk about that. What that question is referring to is basically mixing latex paint with sand and painting it on trees. And it's actually, I think, has potential. We haven't seen it successful yet because of how it's been applied. But the idea is that, of course, beavers don't like the sand, and the latex paint is essentially safe once it's attached to the tree. And the sites that one landowner tried it on, unfortunately, he didn't paint all the way around the tree, and he also didn't paint all that high up. But the cutting that then happened after the fact avoided the paint areas. It is tricky to get the sand to stay in the paint. Obviously, just from a thickness perspective, the sand continues to settle out if you're trying to paint. So I haven't actually tried it myself, but we do know of a few folks who are giving it a try, and we hope to learn about their successes as they try it out. Another question, are there any regulations with regard to installing pond levelers in fish-bearing streams? Good question, and I will only respond from an Alberta perspective because I'm not familiar with all the additional regulations that might apply elsewhere, but there definitely are. And so all of the work you might do in any water body, if it's fish-bearing or a permanent water body, requires approvals, and so you should absolutely be contacting, in our case, Alberta Environment, and potentially they will connect you to fisheries and oceans if required. But in some of the examples I showed, they are non-fish bearing and they are non-connected systems, so they're more of a wetland, and so there was no issue. But in all cases, you should check with the approvals process first, and some of them definitely do require that to be approved before it can happen. So I think that's it for our questions, and we are pretty much out of time. So I really appreciate all of you taking the time to listen in. For those of you that want to listen again, or if you want to let your friends and colleagues know about it, the webinar, of course, was recorded, and you will be receiving a link that identifies where you can come back and listen to it again, or share it with your friends with your registration information. So we appreciate your time and interest today, and do contact us if you have any interest in learning more about some of the work or sharing something that we could add to these kinds of stories to share with others. So thank you, and thanks to Kelsey for being my right-hand gal and the technology, and have a great day.